This is a project I've been working on for quite some time. I designed this table with a few things in mind. I wanted to have a good location for the sound beam projector. Many of you may have seen this projector in a few of the videos I put out, the motorized coffee table and also the outdoor sofa. But this is the last video of this unintentional series. This started off as a very basic media stand that had a location for the projector inside of a drawer that you pull out, set it up, and along the build I decided to switch it up and make it move. So let's take a deep dive into how this piece was created, then I'll show you the many uses of this piece. The bulk of this project is made from 3/4 inch birch plywood. I made a few rips on a table saw to get things down to a manageable size. I find it easier to cut the parts a bit bigger than they need to, then I cut them down to the finer dimensions. When you look at this build, there's only about two things happening here, the bottom and you have the top. To keep things as clean as possible, I cut the top with 45-degree miters. One of the few things I knew before getting into this build was I wanted speakers. So I picked up an inexpensive set of bookshelf speakers, not knowing what they were going to sound like, but they were surprisingly good. So knowing what I wanted to do with them, the challenge was to build this piece and make sure it looks good, but most importantly, it sounds good. I removed all the components from the speaker box and then set them off to the side. When it comes to drilling out the hole for the speakers, there's a number of ways you can go here. I wanted the speakers to be exposed so you can see them. I like that look. But of course I could have easily added a grill by just creating something custom. To drill out the speaker holes, you can use a hole saw like I'm using here. This makes quick work of it, but if you want to save a few bucks, you can totally use a jigsaw. The next thing was on to cutting out the opening for the volume control. I ended up destroying one of the boxes so I can duplicate the holes that were in the speaker box. Initially I wanted to save the box, but after thinking it through, it just made more sense to destroy it and use it as a template. I did notice that the volume control was friction fit. So if I can, I would like to reduplicate the same exact thing. Even though the volume control was recessed into the speaker box and that looked really great, I really didn't see the reward there to try and duplicate that. Now I'll take the speaker panel, use that as the template to cut the same size hole. To match the opening, I'm going to use a flush mounted router bit. But before getting to that, I need to cut out as much of the material as possible. If you're not familiar with a flush bit, it's pretty simple the way it works. You can get a router bit with a top bearing or a bottom bearing. The bearing right along the edge you want to duplicate while the bit is cutting into the material you want to cut. And at this point I have the face to where I like it, so I'm going to sand it down before attaching it to the bottom because it's much easier to do that at this point. I also added pocket holes on the back side of the face, this way I can hide all the fasteners. To start building out the frame for the top part, I located the bottom first, then drew a line 1 inch from the edge for a setback. I wanted the face to look like it was pushed in. With the line in place, I added a bead of wood glue, then placed the face on the line. Then I secured it with pocket hole screws. Now that I have the face in place, I added the inside support. I didn't catch it right away, but I installed it the wrong way. And at the time not knowing, I went on to adding wood glue and the outside piece. It wasn't until here I realized the part was turned the wrong way. Luckily I was able to act fast and remove this before the glue cured. This is what it should have looked like. So I decided to paint the face black because I wanted a strong contrast between the face and the sides. I also wanted the speaker components to just blend right in. After a few hours, the paint was dry to the touch. And now is a good time to start installing the speaker components. I'll begin by installing the speaker ports. If the hole is exact and there's a little bit of friction here, you can use a sander to clean up the hole a bit so that they fit nicely. One by one, I installed the speakers and the tweeters. Now, because I used the speaker box as a template, I was able to get a tight fit for the volume control. The speakers I took apart also came with an IR receiver. That will be centered up with the volume control. Unless you want to cut the cable and extend it, you're pretty much stuck with the length of the cable. And that plugs into the board that's attached to the volume control. When I took the speaker box apart, I left the wires attached to the speakers and left just enough so I can identify which wire goes where. I unsoldered the short speaker wires and resoldered longer ones. When I created the model for this, I had a larger section for the speaker. I was not sure how much this would affect the quality of the sound, so I ended up reducing the built-in speaker box. I added the miter pieces at the end to make it look more presentable while pushing the back to the speaker box closer to the speakers. The inside panel will be attached here and the back to the box would slide in here. I secured the inside panel with pocket hole screws. And on the far end, I used the nail gun. Both of the speaker wires need to be extended and brought over to the middle part of the box. All the parts I've installed up until now will be glued down and permanently installed. This is the back panel for the middle section, and that will be secured by screws. I'm not sure how effective this will be, but it's there just in case. Now I just cut the wire for the speaker terminal. On the original speakers, the left speaker would connect into that terminal that I just cut the wire from, but I want to keep this clean and all the wires hidden. So the wire I just cut needs to be spliced and extended over to the left speaker. Now I can install all the components and secure them down as they were installed in the speakers. I soldered the speaker cable onto the extended wire from the speaker, which was then plugged into the circuit board for the speaker. To wrap up this section, I screwed the back in place, then I secured the speaker back plate. And now was a good time for me to double check that everything worked, so I powered it up and tried out the speakers. And everything seems to function as usual, so I cut some polyfill down to fill in the speaker box. The construction on the lift was pretty simple. I made sort of an open box. I created two of those, one for the bottom and one for the top. The one on the top was made to be smaller so that it can fit within the parameters of the bottom. I also closed off the two ends on the smaller part, which the projector would fit inside this opening. I tried a few different sizes of drawer slides until I found one that made the most sense. The end results of this table is aesthetically taller than I would have liked for it to be. Another thing for me to consider was how much throw would I get from the actuator. And this is a very simple concept of the lift. At this point, I was pretty happy with the movement I saw. This is showing some promise. It did wobble at the end of the movement, so I'll address that later. So right now I'm gonna shift my focus over to the most nerve-wracking part of this build, and that's cutting out the square. The goal here is to reuse the same piece so that the wood grain followed through. One thing I had to keep in mind was how big this hole needed to be. I had to consider the handle of the projector and make sure it had enough clearance for the up and down movement. After I carefully measured off this area, I then taped off the section that I planned to cut out. I used an oscillating tool because this was the thinnest blade I had in my shop on any tool. And that's quite important because I wanted to reuse this piece that I'm cutting out so that the wood grain stayed the same. Overall, I was quite happy with the cutout. It wasn't perfect, but it did look good. I went on to cut the hole out in the bottom, which I made that hole a bit bigger. I didn't have to be as accurate with the bottom one, so I was a bit more relaxed when I cut this one out. I used the benchtop sander to clean up the edge on the top insert. The belt sander was quite aggressive and I ended up taking off too much material from one side. I somewhat regret doing that and wish I'd done it by hand. I did learn my lesson there, so I cleaned up the inside opening using a hand file and sandpaper. With this being a custom build, you have to think ahead to some extent to know which part should go first. So of course, it's easier to apply edge band when the parts are not fully assembled. These parts will be butted up against each other, which means you will have an exposed end, so applying edge band is a must. This is a fairly quick process, so my recommendation is do it as you go instead of waiting till the end and trying to do all the edge band at one time. Now that I have the edge band on these parts, I can now secure these pieces together using pocket hole screws. And with this section taking shape, I also added a few pieces of support at the bottom and also at the top. These pieces will certainly serve their purpose, allowing me to attach this to the top part and also the feet. Eventually, this is how the lift will be installed in the leg. And at this point of time, it's centered in here. I needed to work out the kinks and align this so that everything operates perfectly. The two strips I have on the side, this allowed the lift to go up and down without any wobble. When I cut the hole out in the top, I also cut it so that it was off center. Now that was very important because I couldn't have the projector going up and down directly behind the speaker back panel. So even though I'm rubbing in some paste wax right now, as I mentioned, I'd have to go back and readjust this, and I do need to have this offset to the left just so that it doesn't interfere with the back panel of the speaker plate. So off camera, I made the adjustment for the speaker lift. I also cut in a hole here, which would be for a vent. Just in case the amp warms up, it can pass air through. I'll also cut another hole in the bottom so you have some good airflow. As a way to close off the vent, I used super glue and a thick piece of window screen I had laying around. I repeated the same thing for the hole in the bottom. Before putting the top in place, I applied wood glue on the plywood ends facing up. I did that for all the parts except for the one with the speaker back plate on it. That parts remain to be removable. Now I can sit the top in place, clamp it, and also shoot a few nails in sections to help hold things together. I used the pin nailer, and this way the holes are hardly noticeable. Before moving on, I'll need to set the level of the removable insert. And as a way to keep that insert the same level of the plywood, I used 2 strips of 1/4" plywood. These were scrap pieces of wood I had laying around. But you can use 3/4" plywood as well if you don't have anything thinner. Now just note that these pieces were not installed permanently, they were just screwed in place. In the occasion I need to put off the back panel on the inside, I'll just need to remove these pieces of support and then I can access the back panel. To make this feel more natural, I cut the edge band at the corners at a 45-degree angle so it looked more like a solid piece of board. Now, I think it's safe to say this was one of my more eventful builds. Lots of excitement in here, but there are also some challenges, roadblocks, and design change along the way. One of the more frustrating things were I damaged the miter end before I secured it to the top with my tripod. And with that happening, I had to use a bit of wood filler to cover up the imperfections. To make my life a bit easier when attaching the top to the bottom, I drew out where the bottom should go, so this was a bit easier to just sit on the floor and line this up. After lining up the two, I clamped them together and then add screws. Settling on the finish was way more challenging than I hoped for. I tried a number of finishes and finally I settled on the polyurethane. Even though I tried test pieces after test pieces, I felt confident that this would have been the one that I liked. On a small test piece, it looked great, but once I started to apply this on the back, I had immediate regrets. This was way too dark. So right here, I knew that I couldn't continue to do the entire piece with this finish because I would absolutely hate it. So I went back to another finish that I tried, which was polyacrylic. It was the only finish I had on hand that didn't have a tint in it. I even went to the store trying to find something, and I came back and I settled on something I already had that I should have just went with in the first place. But the main reason I didn't go with it, was because of the edge band, and it wouldn't stain those dark enough. So speaking of the edge band, here's how I solved that issue. The reason why this is even an issue is the edge band is very light and the plywood I use is dark. They're both birch, but they're different color. Both the edge band and the plywood has polyacrylic on it, but they did not take it the same way. So I sanded down the edge band, and then I took some Danish oil and tried to blend the two. That worked out and I was happy with it. So I started making progress again as I began to work on the door panel. All the removable pieces on this build needed to be quick. So let's start with the upper panel, which was designed to be a drawer at first, and then I realized that wouldn't make a lot of sense, so I switched it up to be a pull-off panel, which will be mounted with a set of magnets. I made this process as quick as possible. The stops that would be mounted inside the cabinet area, I drilled those through the door panel. Knowing that they would line up if I drilled it this way, I took out all of the guesswork. Now all I had to do was recess the magnet in both the door panel and the stop. And at this point, I can secure the stop in place with a few brad nails. Now that I have the magnet situation all sorted out, I'll need the ability to pull this off at will. So the most cost-effective way is to do something dual purpose. I'll just cut out a section from this that I can use to grip and pull, but it will also act as a vent, which will allow air to pass through. If you remember this piece, I applied polyurethane to it and it came out very dark. I didn't like the direction, so I waited till it dried, sanded it down, and it was still dark, so it was on a plan B. I took a scrap piece of foam that I had to give me a visual of what this would look like if I was to paint it white. I knew there was no going back. I didn't like the separation it got between the two colors, so white it is. I used a fast drying white paint, and within an hour's time I was able to drill this and move on. Since there isn't much to generate heat in the bottom section of this table, I don't need a big opening, but I still need a way to be able to pull this panel off. I can easily drill a hole in this, but I think a half hole would make more sense. It would be less visible, but just as effective as if I just drilled a hole right into the top. So as shown, I took a small block and used that to secure the wood along the area. I also used the clamp to hold these pieces together. This way I can drill two pieces of wood at one time while cutting half of each. I painted the feet black to blend in with the face of the table. I centered the table on the feet, keeping it in the center from side to side. So the way this table is made, just standing up on the leg itself, it's front heavy, meaning that it can easily tip over if you push it forward. Now adding the feet but favoring it towards the front will prevent that, so now it's really hard to tip it in any direction. And with the leg supported to the feet, I can now install the lift permanently inside the leg. Now at this point, excitement is building. Hardware is going in and we're near the finishing line. At the bottom I installed two magnetic catch, and at the top I installed two roller catches, one on each side. Now together these work as a solid grip holding onto a removable panel. I added a 6 outlet power strip in the bottom, this way all the devices can be plugged into it and we only have one power cord going to the wall. The actuator is connected to an RF relay, which means you can activate it as long as you're within the vicinity of it. And here's what it's going to look like behind the removable panel. So if you need to plug in and unplug the projector or whatever devices you want to plug into here, it's really easy, quick, and convenient. Let's take a look at this from the bottom up. There will be times that I need to take the projector out of here and take it to a new location. So having the back removable makes things a lot easier, especially when you have a quick access. These types of projects are what excites me the most. It makes me think, it challenges my abilities, and it's really awesome and rewarding to be able to pull something like this off.
When I turn up, you know I'm on my, yes I'm on my, yes I'm on my, I am so, yes I am so, I'm on my.
This is one of the most exciting projects I worked on in a long time, and no matter how much I plan in the beginning, I always tend to change the design along the way. I actually find it to be a lot more enjoying than something I planned out and it goes well. Right now I'm casting this on the wall, but the plan is to add a projector screen. On a day-to-day we use a 65-inch TV in our family room, but on movie nights we want to go bigger. Now I don't have the wall space to go a full 150-inch screen like this projector offers, but we can easily get a 120-inch screen on this wall. And with this being 4K and 2500 looms, this thing is bright. And without a doubt, this is the best projector I've ever experienced. So building a piece around it and then trying to keep the details like keeping the grain in the removable piece, that was quite challenging, but we got through it and I'm super proud of that. And if you can believe this, I almost didn't add LEDs to this project, but I knew you guys were gonna get me if I didn't add it. So I kept it simple. I wrapped it around the inside where the projector sits, and this way it gives off a really soft glow and it looks really cool. And with the quality this projector put out, I had to find a way that I can easily access it and put it to use. And everything about this build is meant to be quick, simple, and very convenient. Not only does it house this projector, but you can use it as a two-sided piece. On one side, it's like a normal console table that you can store books and different things in it. And on the other side, you have the speakers, and this piece is completely Bluetooth enabled. So not only can you play the sound from the projector on the speakers, but you can also just connect to it with your devices, and you can push it up against the wall, and you can also place it behind a sofa, which is what I'm doing here. So we can experience this from both sides. If we want to sit behind it, using it as like a simple bar, or just sitting up to it, or we can go sit in front of it and enjoy the scene. And speaking of sitting in front of it, it's designed to clear a person's head. And with that said, this is another dope build. If you enjoyed this build and would like more details on this project, be sure to check out the links down in the video description. The documentation on this build is quite intense, so I'll have that out in a few days, so be sure to look out for the written version over on the website DIYcreators.com, and also the plans are coming soon. That's it for this one, and I'll see you on the next.